Well, as I was saying, welcome to Highley, and I hope that you've begun to settle into this lovely place, set in our beautiful English countryside, which has been helped on by the rain and making it lovely and green. Hope you don't get too wet. Because most of you were at the Sacred Heart Mass on Friday, and when already many of you had been here for some days, you will by now know that you are indeed very welcome. And those of you who weren't at the Mass on Friday, you're extra welcome. We are already well into our Seeking Spirit conference. Many of you explored London at the end of last week, following the Janet Stewart Trail, in the context of getting to know the city in which she lived a good part of her life. Yesterday, you travelled to Cottesmore to know at first hand the place of her birth and early years, and to reflect on different aspects of her life experiences and writings. This morning we celebrated Mass close to her, and with her blessing upon us, we have arrived here. To begin the next stage of our journey, Sue will now be inviting us into a closer study and reflection of who Janet was and is for us. So, without more ado, I introduce her. Hang on. For me, the most important thing about Sue is that she is a member of the provincial team, and together with Lorraine, supports me in the leadership of the province. However, I acknowledge that this is only a part of her current RSCJ life. She is a member of the Lanarkwen community, helping Steph to run our retreat centre and accompanying directees. And she is also on council at Roehampton University. Sue combines her gifts as educator and teacher with those of critical researcher and lover of the English language. Putting all these talents together, the result is a fascinating and lively exploration of often little known and at times quite gossipy aspects of Janet Stewart's life. Those who were with us last year at the similar conference can attest to the fact that we have a real treat in store. So you may now come.
I wasn't expecting that at all. Well, I've done this once before, though it was a different talk. It was after dinner, and I was able to tell people then if they got bored they could have another glass of wine, because we were still all, if those of you will remember, sitting at the dinner tables. You've got nowhere to hide now, you have to listen or you can snore quietly. My talk is called The Seeking Spirit, not the finished article. I hope by the end of it you'll see why I've called it that. But basically, just to give you a sort of overall feel for it, I'm taking some moments in Janet's life and I'm reflecting on them in the context of centenary celebrations or other significant events that are happening in our lives now. So that's the sort of structure of it. In 1903, Janet Stewart gave a conference which in the typescript has been given the title, The Age of Transition. She begins, "Our needs vary according to our environment. Our educational life follows the same rule, and its environment varies with astonishing rapidity when we come to a moment of retrospect." Her talk is about changes in the educational environment of the 1870s, when the man of the hour, Sir Joshua Fitch, was spearheading improvement of standards in schools and in women's education. And it was his death in 1903 that was the occasion of her talk. Those of us that can remember the 1870s, she would have been a teenager then, can remember what a man of light and leading he was, she reminisces. Now we have come to a moment of retrospect as we look back at the life of Janet Erskine Stuart and try to assess what she, a woman of light and leading, may mean for ourselves, just as she was doing when she looked back at Joshua Fitch's life and assessed what he had done in the context of his own time. Fitch, she said, was a product of his time, responding to its needs. And she challenges her listeners to reflect on how times have changed at the beginning of the 20th century. The context of 1903 was different. There are new needs, she says, new pressures, and it's no good trying to copy the past. The response to the needs of this age must be a response that is of the present moment. Context, or environment as she called it, is everything. In different ways, the papers offered during this conference that celebrates the centenary of the end of Janet's life use this moment of retrospect to reflect on how her self-gift to God and to the society was shaped by her environment and context. And aware that we are living in a quite different age of transition, I hope they will help us to reflect on what her life and example might have to say to us in our very different time. So in this talk, I want to help set the scene by situating some moments in her life in the context of her own time as introductions to the topics that others will be sharing with us later in this conference. This is a way of trying to bring her alive. A person who was the product of a particular set of circumstances and whose interaction with those circumstances sometimes transcended them and so continues to speak to us 100 years later. And at the same time, a person who sometimes also seems a little bit backward looking, to be honest, or at least who unreflectingly mirrored some attitudes that we would like to think we have moved away from. I want to suggest a case for Janet Stuart, not as the finished article, the polished and perfect religious she was sometimes made out to be, but as someone we should remember for being a flawed human being like us, but one who, whatever the occasional limitations of her response to the context in which she lived, remained true to her inspiration. And that inspiration was always to be a seeking spirit, and to take literally the truth of what she sought, and the truth of the one whom she discovered had already found her. So can we have the next slide, please, Janet? So I'm starting at the end. We are remembering Janet Stuart's death in October 1914. The photo that is here, it's a little bit blurred, but some of you will recognise it from the display we had at Roehampton, is of her coffin, which is laid out in the old chapel, now no longer there, and the door just on the left, of course, is the side entrance to the little Sacred Heart Chapel. So we're remembering her death in October 1914 and simultaneously also remembering the outbreak of the First World War. A conflagration that tore apart the world in ways we still inherit the consequences of today. And you just need to think of the struggles in Iran and Iraq, which have some of their roots, at any rate, at that period. It's just one of many examples. She died before she could see the true horror of this war, especially as it was experienced in France and Belgium, and as it affected the personal lives of so many of her sisters. You have only to look at the war memorial at Roehampton, if any of you are going back. It's just near the entrance gate. And there are many names there, surnames of families, of the brothers or the uncles or even the fathers of sisters at the Roehampton community of the time. And also in the First World War in 1914 and 15, after her own death, there were 3 of her nephews killed in battles in France. However, though she missed this, she did see some of the horror of the war. Maud Monaghan tells the story of her final journey from Brussels to Roehampton as a refugee of the invasion of Belgium. It would make exciting reading, were one not aware that Janet was already mortally ill. Maud Monaghan tells us of how she set up the convent in Brussels as a first aid centre, about the impossibility of getting reliable news or communicating it with other houses, communicating that news with other houses, of the death of the superior in Liège, a victim of a sniper, as she was closing shutters against street fighting, of Janet's 12 to 14 hour journey instead of the 2 hours it should have taken, without passports, by tram, by train, by horse and cart, from Brussels to Ostend, and the hours then waiting in a queue in the rain for a place in a ferry to England, a ferry that was forced, of course, to sail across the channel without lights so as to avoid enemy action. Janet loved Germany and all things German. Goethe had been her favourite author, she said, as a teenager, which takes some reading, so I think that's impressive in itself. The governess who supported and guided her intellectual awakening was German. She learned fluent German as a child and grew up in a cultural ambience that was thoroughly Germanophile. Edward Thring, the headmaster at Uppingham School and a family friend, was married to a German and introduced numerous, apparently 18 over his career, numerous German masters into his school to teach music, languages and science. His daughters, like the Stuart girls, were educated by German and Swiss governesses, and his wife's personal maid was also German. Canon Stuart holidayed with his family in the spa at Kissingen in Germany for his health every summer. The attraction of German culture was deeply fashionable. Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, was himself German, and as the aristocratic families that networked Great Britain at that time, and Ireland, saw themselves as an extension of the royal family, so Victoria's family loyalties were mirrored in their own enthusiasms. Janet used examples from German customs and practices to illustrate points made in conferences, especially on education, where Germany was widely recognised as a pioneer both in philosophy and in educational practice. There are references to the gymnasium system and to the German educational reformist and founder of pedagogy as an academic discipline, Johann Friedrich Herbar. Sometimes she uses a German word in her letters or conferences when no English word quite will do. Remarkably, her last words, as reported by Maud Monaghan in Life and Letters, are in German. Now forgive my German here, because I don't speak it, but ich kann nicht mehr. I can't go on any longer. And I think that's really odd, surprising, that her last words are in German. However, in spite of these intellectual and emotional affiliations, as political tensions began to build towards war, Janet was, like most of her countrymen and women, invincibly patriotic in her view of it, and obviously ignorant of the horrors to come. In 1910, she reported laconically of her nephew Bobby that he was employed as an engineer with Vickers Maxim, making Maxim guns, which were the main kind of automatic guns that were used at the beginning of the war in Europe. And Bobby, of course, was killed, probably by one of them, in 1915. In a letter to Roehampton from occupied Belgium in 1914, she echoes the just war propaganda of the time, with the Lion England coming to the rescue of gallant little Belgium. Forgive me saying that, but that's how it was said at the time. Retrieving England's damaged reputation after its blunders during the Boer War of 12 years previously. In January 1911, she had written to Mabel Digby that there was less talk now of war, though she still feared what England will have seen before 21 years are over. What do we retrieve from this for ourselves? One thing is that Janet Stewart was not afraid enough of war. That if she had time to, on the other hand, surely she would have experienced a particular sadness that the enmity in Europe was focused against her beloved Germany, making her fondness for Bach or for Goethe potentially treasonable. You could be arrested if you were too enthusiastic in England for German culture at the time. That she is divided from us by this, the first great global catastrophe of the 20th century, and that it is the more remarkable, therefore, that so much, though not all, of her voice, as it comes across in her letters and her conferences and so on, seems fresh, alive, and in certain respects, relevant. On the brink of her voyage to Australia in 1913, she wrote, "May God be with everyone, at all times, and in every place where we are scattered, but still more than ever, one in CJN." She could not have known quite how needed this attitude was going to be. A second context. This is a context very relevant to those of us who live in these islands, which is the upcoming Scottish referendum. And on this I have pinned the complexity of nationality and which nationality, if any, in these islands you identify with. Janet had English, Irish and Scottish antecedents, and always identified with her Scottish roots. Can we have the next slide, please, Janet? Oh, okay, that's fine. It's all right, it's okay. Always identified with her Scottish roots, which were, to be frank, remote. The first photograph at the top left of the slide is her mother, Penelope Noel, and she was as English as it was possible to be, with ancestors tailing back to businessmen in medieval Warwickshire, possibly the same time as Shakespeare. Maybe they knew each other, who knows? Her father's family, her father is the gentleman, obviously, with the beard. Her father's family, a branch of whose ancestors were traced back to Robert the Bruce, had lived in the north of Ireland since around 1611. And were part of the so-called plantation of the Scottish James VI and First of England. Janet's closest Scottish connections during her lifetime were not really blood relatives, as far as I know, but relatives by marriage. And we'll be hearing more from Nora and Moira later about aspects of Janet's connections with both Ireland and Scotland. My remarks focus here on how she imbibed her identification with her very remote Scottish ancestors. Just before her birth, Janet's father had published a genealogical study of his ancestors with the intention of resolving his family's claim to a hereditary title in Scotland. He tried to demonstrate that an apparently illegitimate connection was in fact legitimate. So this is the racy after dinner story. His claim was that the female ancestor whose marital status was disputed, i.e. she was a mistress, not a wife, was in fact the lawful wife of the 15th century heir to this title. And therefore his branch of the Stuart clan should inherit that lapsed title with its lands in Scotland. Now he failed, it seems, or his family failed, in this case. But the claim is interesting, in my view, because of the name of the dodgy lady, way back. Her name was Janet Erskine. And Andrew Stuart's emotional investment in his argument is shown in his choice of name for the daughter born to him not long after he had published his book. Yeah, that's okay. I'm a bit muddled with my slides, but it will be all right. So we just have here a photograph of Theodosia with one of Janet's brothers on our left, Beatrice, Janet's elder sister, standing on the right, and Janet, aged about two, sitting on her knee. So I use this just for fun, really, but also because I've been talking about Janet just being born. Anyway, so she was called Janet Erskine Stuart, and the moral Andrew Godfrey Stuart pushes home in his conclusion is that his descendants would do well. So these children would do well to avoid the inconsistencies and hypocrisies of the Catholic Church, which, in spite of its official stance, allowed divorce among the wealthy, because in his argument, the first wife of the gentleman that Janet Erskine knew had been divorced in order for Janet Erskine to marry him. That's his argument. So the hypocrisies of the Catholic Church, which allows divorce among the wealthy and yet is picky about degrees of consanguinity, which is another complication of this story, which I won't go into. And Andrew Stuart says, to sustain the honour of an ancient name is a priority for his descendants. So there's been a bit of a mess up way back in time, so we've got to do everything we can, my children, to sustain the honour of the Stuart name. Now Janet did not obey, as we know, his first injunction, which was to avoid the Catholic Church, but she was deeply impressed by the second. At one level, it played out in her close identification with upper-class noblesse oblige and her leaning towards conservative politics. At another much more interesting level, she transferred her romantic desire to sustain the honour of an ancient name to her love of the society and its charism, using, for example, heraldry as a motif for spirituality. There's a lot of sort of heraldic stuff in the Chapel of the Sacred Heart. And there's also a letter that she writes home while she's on her travels, where she encourages the school at Roehampton to teach the children heraldry. because they can play with the idea of shields and devices. It's the idea of having a devise, which we're all used to in the society. They can use it as a way of meditating. If they make the heraldry of Christ, for example, or Mary, they can meditate on the characteristics of their faith and their religion. Yes, and in one of her last conferences at Roehampton, next slide please, Janet, hopefully. No, never mind. She encourages the community to consider themselves as daughters of God's royal family with the spiritual prerogatives of that status, true liberty of spirit, perfect assurance or security in the unfailing devotion of God to our good. So this idea of being the daughter of a royal family. And somebody, it was Margaret I think, who had told me that Janet's great nephew, Patrick Castle Stewart, is not here today sadly, because it would have been lovely for everyone to have met him, but he's off finding out whether he is truly a blood descendant of the royal family of Stuarts, Bonnie Prince Charlie and all that lot. So it's still going on, this interest in that family. Now Janet's half-brothers, Richard and Andrew. Andrew was the future Earl, grandfather of the person I've just told you about, represent the global spread of the extended family. Andrew had been a civil servant in India for most of his adult life, while Richard, whom she calls in one letter, my wild man of the woods, had emigrated to Australia, and we'll be hearing later from Rita about what he got up to there. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were at that time part of the British Empire, and Richard's emigration there was typical of what younger sons in large families did to make a living. When Janet visited Australia and New Zealand, she was visiting communities largely composed at that time of sisters from England, Scotland and Ireland. They were new enough in their new country to still see Britain or Ireland as home, and she was bringing a sense of home to them, demonstrating to them how much, as she said in the letter I quoted above, how much they were valued. After all, many of them had been her own novices, and this is perhaps one reason underpinning her enthusiastic reception there. A third, Rita, of course, I think I've said this, Rita will be telling us more about all of that on Tuesday. Now, a third context, and this one is a bit of a cheat, as it hasn't started yet, is the year of consecrated life, from October 2014 to 15. And on this, I've chosen to hang the idea of Janet as a seeking spirit, seeking for her spiritual home, which she found first in the Catholic Church, secondly in the Society, and thirdly in Roehampton, which at one level, in my view, became a substitute for the country house of her childhood, where we visited many of us yesterday. Fourthly, of course, and most importantly, her home was the God whom she sought in all these different homes. The context here is the context for Janet's choice of religious life, and her choice, in that choice of religious life, of the Society. She'd become a Catholic in 1879, just a few months after her sister Theodosia's death. Clearly, there had been some longer brooding on this step, which was so opposed by her father, who had suspicion of Catholicism, as we have seen, bred into his bones, and who had direct experience of the upheaval that such a conversion might cause in the conversion of his own elder brother, the fourth Earl, and in other members of his family. Tangentially, he would have been aware of the recent tragic death, this is scandalous story number 2, the recent tragic death of Janet's older Catholic cousin, Lady Blanche Lady Blanche Noel, daughter of the convert Earl of Gainsborough, a cousin on her mother's side. Lady Blanche had followed her heart into an unsuitable marriage with the organist of the family's private chapel, who was an Irishman. But the point was not that was what he was, but the point was that he was not wealthy and he was not aristocratic. And separated from her family, because obviously having married him against the will of her parents, she was no longer allowed to live at home. This is Blanche. Separated from her family, she died near Boston at about the same time that Janet was considering conversion. Neither Catholicism nor following her heart, the canon might have thought, had brought Blanche happiness. Janet, as we know, was determined, nevertheless. And after walks and talks with various friends and the guidance of Father Peter Galway, S.J., she made her profession of faith in front of the Sacred Heart altar at Farm Street. Can we have the next slide? Yeah. The decision to enter religious life came 3 years later. Janet had been working as a volunteer with a group of young women under the auspices of the Helpers of the Holy Souls. She visited hospitals and workhouses, met with a prayer group and a sewing group every Monday afternoon for discussions. She seems to have been attracted to that order, perhaps to its outward-going work with the poor, and especially to its charism of offering up all its apostolic work as prayer for those who had died and had not yet found their peace with God in heaven. Also, she may have been hoping to find there a way of realizing a dream that she had of going to South Africa to teach catechism to the people she called, in a term that is now racist, though it was not seen so then, she called them the Kafirs. There must have been some understanding that she was considering entering with the Helpers, as once she had made up her mind to enter the society, she is said to have gone there with tears in her eyes to see the superior and inform her that God was calling her elsewhere. And this was after an epiphanic experience in Regent's Park, on her way to one of the Monday afternoon meetings with the Helpers, when she passed a flower bed packed with bedding plants, the deep blue of hyacinth bulbs flowering en masse in a late spring. She will have been arrested by their scent as well as their colour, but the main thing that happened was what she described later as a moment outside time, when the word of God came to me and I saw it all. Evidently, this was a critical moment and a critical choice. Why did her choice fall on the society? The fact that Father Galway preached at ladies' retreats at Roehampton will have had something to do with it, I'm sure. Galway had hoped for a convent for Janet where she could see a grand view and always have her heart lifted to rejoice in God's creation. And Roehampton was at that time a gracious house set in an attractive semi-rural landscape. It's hard to imagine that now. And it would have felt in some respects like home in many ways. But I think more interesting things may have been going on too in her choice of the society. The heart was important to Janet. One of her lifelong struggles was to integrate her heart and her very good mind. Her preferred way of praying, she had written to Galway, was with her heart more than with her mind. She did have a gift for relationships and deep feelings for people and for nature. She was attracted to heartfelt contemplation as well as to intellectual pursuits, and, of course, she loved teaching. Devotion to the Sacred Heart, though she probably had experienced very little of it, was becoming popular and widespread in the mid-19th century. The newly dedicated altar and the aisle, Sacred Heart aisle, at Farm Street Church was just one symptom of it. Although the prospect of enclosure, or semi-enclosure, was costly for her, the contemplative strand of the Society's charism would have been attractive. She often described herself as shy, though I think this has to be nuanced. Really, she liked solitude, and she found very little of that in convent life at the time. Her chatty letters, her loyalty to relationships, her love of people suggest that the relational side of the Society's spirituality may have been very appealing. There was also its global reach and the possibility that she might be asked to work overseas. And perhaps, too, the choice of the Society, with its charism of glorifying the heart of Jesus and making it known through the means primarily of education, was also reflected a positive step in her private struggle with grief and bereavement. There had been many, many members of her family who had died, of course most significantly recently to this step she took, that of her foster mother and half-sister Theodosia. The focus of the helpers at that time was on doing good in this life in order to help souls out of purgatory. The focus of the Society was on a personal relationship with Jesus in order to win people while still alive to know his love for them. So we might see a shift in her own spirituality taking place at this time. In 1913, she wrote of this meditative, imitative, penetrating, inward manner of devotion, which imposes no set form and admits of endless diversity of assimilation. And it is this that she identifies and loves as the characteristic spirituality of the Society, played out in varieties of ways in the different characters of individuals and different communities. The one thing necessary, she wrote in the conference for the Roehampton community on December the 31st, 1909, is our individual, personal hold on God and our relationship with him. Shall we dare to have another slide, please, Janet? Excellent. A relationship founded in the balance of faith, hope, and love, which is rooted in profound belief that the one who prays is herself loved. Fidelity to the rule is fidelity to this personal relationship. We work hard, she told the communities in Melbourne and in Timaru in December, January 1913 to 14. But our work is not our telos. Our energy for work should come from the overflow of prayer, which has resulted in identification with God's own love and sympathy as shown in the heart and mind of Christ, which in prayer we have put on. And then she says this: remember how much you are to God and what he thinks of your value. Dwell on the extraordinary greatness of our destiny. We come from God, we go to God. God is our end, our telos, and dwell on this. God will have only gods for his sons and daughters. We can never exhaust the possibilities of our vocation. Of course, she's talking to religious, but she would also agree this is true for all Christians. The spiritual journey she embarked on in Regent's Park in 1882, which took her to this point, is one I explored in detail last year, and some aspects of it I'll represent later on during this conference. Also, Mary Hind will be sharing a fascinating piece of research that she has done on how Janet found her own unique voice as a spiritual guide, especially in her role as novice mistress, and how she was able to share the fruits of her personal discoveries with the many she educated in the life of the Spirit. Next slide, please. Now, for consistency's sake, it would be good if I could find an anniversary or a special occasion for the next topic, which is education, but I can't, to be honest. However, perhaps education doesn't need a special anniversary, as it's an ongoing topic, never stops. The day after I wrote that sentence, there was a whole episode of a radio current affairs programme on current problems in higher education. And what they boiled down to was how the relationship between student and tutor was becoming increasingly transactional and utilitarian. That training at university was substituting for education. And that's exactly the sort of debate that Janet would have been very familiar with in the early years of the 20th century. Now, we will be hearing later from Fran and Mieko about Janet's contribution and impact on education of young women in America and in Japan. Here, I want to just sketch in a little about the roots of her passion for education and to outline some points about her attitude to higher education for women that I'm afraid I chickened out completely of mentioning in my talk at Roehampton a few days ago, though I was consoled that Sandra Schneiders did mention it. She had very similar things to say. So, next slide. Yeah, some charming young girls. They really are rather sweet. These are children at Roehampton, at the private school there, in around the time that Janet would have been teaching there as an aspirant. So it could be that they knew her. What were the roots of Janet's passion for education? I should not mind what I taught so long as I could teach somebody something, she once said. One route was possibly the successful, stimulating education she herself had received from at least one of her governesses, Fräulein Rintz von Berger, whose books and conversations encouraged Janet's propensity to think for herself and to enjoy the challenge of intellectual stretching. Another source was the interest in education which formed part and parcel of her upbringing. Her father was closely involved with the National School in Cottesmore. I was delighted yesterday when those of us who were there were able to go into the grounds of the rectory, and I was shown, at any rate, where the school used to be. And suddenly I could imagine it. I never could quite imagine Janet being allowed to traipse across Cottesmore and go into some school on the other side of Cottesmore. She, even though it's a tiny place, she was a lady. It wouldn't have been acceptable, really. But now I understand that the school was actually within the garden area of her house, though not part of the house. It somehow fits. So, her father was closely involved in that school. He was its main funder until long after the law required it to be funded by the ratepayers. The school journal, which still exists, from the 1870s, records that Canon Stewart was in and out of the school very frequently. He often took religion classes, and the always overwhelmingly positive judgments of Her Majesty's Inspectorate, which was led in the East Midlands by the same Mr. Fitch, whose death I quoted Janet reflecting on at the beginning of this talk. In other words, she almost certainly knew him. Those positive comments were summarised in Canon Stewart's handwriting in the journals throughout the 1860s and 70s. There are records in the journal of hand-ruled notebooks, poetry books, chalk pieces cut from a big block of chalk into suitable sizes for the teacher, being received from the rectory. And I ask myself, who cut the chalk? Who ruled the exercise books? I love the idea of Janet and Beatrice sitting with their governess round the kitchen table, or the schoolroom table more likely, doing just those little jobs. School treats were held in the rectory garden. Just a few months before Janet became a Catholic, a local paper describes just such a treat, and 3 cheers that were given by the children for the Mrs. Stewart, in other words, Beatrice and Janet, who had led the games and provided the cakes. Cheers were also raised for the fairly elderly canon who organised races and threw coins for the children to catch, and who addressed them all on how the British Empire was won on the playing fields of Eton. Everybody knows that. And, he hoped, also on the sports grounds on which the Cottesmore children played. Janet will certainly have been influenced in her sense of education as a vocation by the example of her half-sister and substitute mother, Theodosia, whose surviving correspondence is full of allusions to her own love of teaching. Theodosia taught Sunday school to village girls and the younger servants around the dining room table. Maybe the same room that is now used as a dining room where we were yesterday. But for several years, in her late teens, that's Theodosia's late teens, she also acted as an assistant teacher in the school itself. For several hours a week, taking reading lessons and teaching the Bible, and half an hour or so, as she puts it, of something else. She wrote to her cousin by her father's second marriage, whose name was Victoria Noel, that she loved this teaching work, and that she hoped that God would use her through it to touch the hearts of her pupils for his glory. I think that's astonishing. Janet herself taught Sunday school in the local hamlet of Barry, which is just about a mile away from Cottesmore. But she also, as we know, taught maths to a senior class of apprentices and pupil teachers at Cottesmore. Now, this was a real class of teenage girls and boys, all so keen to improve themselves that they gave up the only free time they ever had in the week to gain the qualifications they needed for a professional career. They were in the fields, or they were teaching in the school, helping as pupil teachers. They had to work on Saturday, they had to go to church on Sunday morning, and then they attended Janet's class on Sunday afternoon. That Janet lent a method book full of penciled annotations to one of these pupil teachers, who happened to be the son of the headmaster, shows that she took her own preparation for this job very seriously. I'm assuming the penciled annotations were her own. I don't know for sure. Clearly, it was a class that would have come under close scrutiny from the headmaster, who was the father of some of its pupils, and this will have impacted on Janet positively, not only because of the support, but also because Cattell was highly praised by the inspectorate for his own outstanding work in keeping the high standards in the school, which routinely carried off most of the prizes in competitive public examinations. In one year, they got 39 prizes in the Rutland area. The school with the next number of prizes was the Uppingham National School, not the public school, the national school, where they only got 19. So it really was good by the standards of its time. Another source of Janet's inspiration as an educator was the presence of Edward Thring, headmaster of the famous public, which for those of you who aren't English means private, school in the neighbouring village of Uppingham. We have a wonderful education system. Thring's theories were published from the 1850s onwards, and by the 1880s he was best known for his patronage of women's teacher training colleges and girls' grammar schools. His lectures to these bodies were influential on attitudes to women's education and training of women teachers, especially in the last 20 years of the 19th century. Many of his ideas, which focused on the importance of self-development, the education of individuals as unique individuals, the limitations of examinations and testing as a method of teaching, and the responsibility of teachers to foster aptitudes in every child, however limited their abilities appeared, Many of these ideas will have peppered the discussions that took place when he visited the Stuarts. Maud Monaghan says he was in and out all the time. And also, they were very characteristic of Janet Stuart's own thought, as expressed in her lectures to the teaching staff and the trainees at Roehampton and in America between 1898 all the way through to 1908, and which formed the basis of her book, The Education of Catholic Girls. Now, I said that Janet Stuart was just an ordinary person, and so she has her backward-looking bits as well as her inspiring bits. And with all this liberal openness, we might be surprised at Janet Stuart's hesitations, expressed clearly in Education of Catholic Girls and elsewhere, about whether or not women should go to university. Especially, we should be surprised at this, as she has a reputation for promoting higher education, particularly among her religious sisters. Now, she did promote serious study, and because she wanted teachers at Sacred Heart schools to be well-informed and mentally disciplined, and because from 1906 onwards, teachers at training colleges needed to have or be working towards a degree, these were the reasons why she encouraged them to get qualifications. But she was lukewarm about university for other purposes, for women. And the wider context of this is important. Her comments in The Education of Catholic Girls and elsewhere need to be seen as part of the debates of the late 19th and early 20th centuries about admission of women to the university in England. There were two schools of thought, spearheaded by the Victorian reformers of women's education. On the one hand, Emily Davies promoted the idea that women should receive the same education as men, with the same degrees, but in colleges that were for women only. And she was foundress of Girton College in Cambridge, which was a women's only college for many years. On the other hand, Eleanor Sidgwick argued that women should be able to get degrees, but only in subjects that were suitable for women, and they should be taught in ways different from men, ways that were more suitable for women. She also founded a women's college at Cambridge called Newnham College, which experimented with these ideas in the early days. Janet's views were more in line with Eleanor Sidgwick than with Emily Davies. However, she also had to contend with the requirements of the Catholic hierarchy. For centuries, the Catholic Church had banned young Catholic men, let alone women, from attending British, therefore non-Catholic universities at all. And although this ban was finally rescinded in 1895, the Catholic Church didn't rescind it for women until 1907. And there's a very interesting story that I don't know much about, but I'm getting interested in behind that. Janet was aware of these circumstances and debates. Like John Henry Newman 60 years earlier, she thought the best kind of university education would be a liberal education on an Oxford-Cambridge model of tutorials and all-round culture that would form the moral and social character of the student, and enmesh them in a network of lifetime relationships that would support their post-university lives and careers. Now, although some women, and Janet really was only thinking about middle-class or upper-class women, might have to attend university to open the door to careers in teaching and medicine, most women, in her view, were called by God to contribute to society as, guess what? Wives and mothers, mediating the things of God to their menfolk. No university existed that could or would prepare them for that. For these reasons, she turned down opportunities in 1902 and 1906 to open a house of studies in Oxford for Catholic women following degree courses there. She preferred the idea of getting government backing for Roehampton as a training school for RSCJ wishing to qualify as secondary teachers or teacher training college teachers. Moreover, of course, now this is the real, moreover, RSCJ have given up the glamour of the world. And the only reason to go to Oxford rather than study for a degree from the safety of your convent, which you could do in London, was the cachet of an Oxford degree. It's a nuisance, but you couldn't get the degree. You could study for it, you could pass the exams, get top marks above all the men, and still not be given a degree in those days. Now, these sorts of debates are out of date and irrelevant now, but I thought it worth briefly referring to this particular episode in Janet Stewart's career, as it does highlight that her world was different from ours, and her attitudes and prejudices were sometimes one we would disagree with. It's an example of how an after-dinner conversation with Janet Stewart might, for us, end up feeling a bit sticky. Sometimes she could be quite bafflingly snobby about, especially, secular convert ladies, even though she was a convert herself. Now, Mary Quinlan mentions this in her book. The Oxford hostel debate provides an example, as among Janet's arguments against opening this House of Studies was her suspicion of the lay founder of a newly formed Catholic Women's League in England, a lady called Margaret Fletcher, who in my view deserves only applause for her indefatigable work to improve educational opportunities for Catholic lay women and to encourage the Church to value their contribution to its life more highly. She deserves a book, this woman. On the other hand, there are aspects of Janet's refusal to help promote higher education for Catholic women that we might admire. For example, her singleness of purpose. She wanted at this time to focus her efforts on making a success of the new foundations she was responsible for in Scotland and the northeast of England, both of which involved establishing training schools and colleges. And she had limited resources. Also, we might admire her conviction that the educational vocation of the society had to be rooted in its contemplative core, although in her understanding this was necessarily expressed in an enclosed monastic lifestyle. And finally, though I believe she was completely misled in her approach to the Catholic Girls at University debate, her argument that women should not necessarily be forced along traditional channels of a higher education developed by a patriarchy could be an interesting one, as long, that is, as the people making decisions about how women's education should be structured included well-informed women with the power to resist or influence patriarchal hegemony, which was not the case. However, I think the story indicates too, and this is in her favour as well, that she was really engaged with debates about higher education and she wanted to think things through. The ideas she moots in her article in The Month on how the Japanese educate women may be seen in this context, and we'll hear more about it from Mieko later on. Now, to end. Yes, no, don't change it yet, don't change it yet. I called this talk Janet Stewart, The Seeking Spirit, not the finished article. Janet had a reputation for being just that, the perfect religious, the finished article, but she wasn't. I think in the previous paragraphs, which highlight some of the aspects we are picking up in this meeting, that we see some things that made her great, and some things that make her now seen as she was, a limited human being, just as we are. When I think about her, I like to keep both these perspectives in play. Can we have the next slide, please? After I finished the draft of this introduction, I came across an appropriate metaphor in one of Janet's conferences for the Feast of Pentecost. When we pick up a beautiful crystal made by God's hand in inanimate nature, we do not fix our minds on the flaws or defects, but upon the laws of light, of reflection, the glory of it, and our mind is hushed into silence by the beauty of God's work. The point here is that the flaws of the crystal contribute to the unique ways it reflects light. Some of her most important insights, for example, on education, were mixed with attitudes we might not always find inspiring or helpful. Other important insights on the spiritual life, on prayer, on how as RSCJ we live our journey to God, how as everybody we live on our journey to God. These insights were often left only partly articulated or informally articulated, unpublished, as she died so early in her mandate. But she was someone who seriously lived the belief that all, and this I'm quoting now the recent formation document, that all our raw material for sanctity is in the now. And she did her best with that, a seeking spirit who sought that sanctity in her here and now, and leaving us to carry on this work. To play on words a little, she, an unfinished article, leaves us the space to continue to write it in our own lives, inspired by her seeking spirit. Thank you.